Before Steve Jobs was a revolutionary who put a computer in every pocket, he was an abandoned infant taken home to a modest garage in Mountain View, California, by a machinist who taught him that beauty lives inside machines. Chapter 1: The Abandoned Child. San Francisco, February 1955. The city smelled like salt and diesel and ambition, and somewhere in its fog-threaded streets, a young woman was preparing to do the hardest thing she would ever do. Her name was Joanne Schiebel, a Wisconsin girl with a graduate student schedule and an unmarried woman's impossible situation. The man she loved, Abdul Fattah Jandali, was a Syrian teaching assistant, brilliant, warm, and entirely unacceptable to her conservative father, who had made clear in the blunt language fathers used in those days that he would cut her off completely if she married him. Joanne had traveled to San Francisco partly to find a doctor willing to help her, and partly, perhaps, to be somewhere far enough from home that the grief of her choice might feel survivable. She was going to have the baby. She was not going to keep him. These two facts sat inside her like stones. On February 24, 1955, she gave birth to a boy. She had one condition for the adoption, which she stated plainly and which she meant with everything in her. The family must be college-educated. She had forms prepared. She had a plan. The couple originally selected was a lawyer and his wife, and for a brief moment the future flickered down one corridor, a boy with a library and a family name attached to a firm. Then the lawyer's wife decided at the last minute that she wanted a girl instead. The forms were rerouted. A new family was found: Paul Jobs, a machinist and high school dropout, and his wife Clara, who had never finished college either. By any measure, they were not what Joanne had asked for. She refused to sign the adoption papers at first. The standoff lasted weeks, and it was only after Paul and Clara signed a written promise, a legal pledge that they would send this child to college, that Joanne finally let go. She let go of a boy she named Stephen Paul Jobs. Paul and Clara lived in Mountain View, California, a quiet peninsula town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Their house was modest in the way that phrase actually means: small rooms, a tidy yard, neighbors who worked with their hands. Paul Jobs could fix almost anything, and he took genuine pleasure in the doing of it, in the particular satisfaction of understanding how something came apart so you could put it back together better. Clara was warm and steady, the kind of woman whose competence looked like effortlessness because she never needed it admired. They had wanted a child for years. When Stephen arrived, they treated the fact of him like a small daily miracle. Whatever storm had surrounded his first weeks on Earth, Steve Jobs himself remembered almost nothing of it, which is, of course, exactly how infancy works. But children are emotional archaeologists. They dig without knowing they're digging. Somewhere in his early years, Steve became aware, gradually, in the way that impossible things become possible to understand only in pieces, that he had been given up, that there had been a before Paul and Clara. He would later describe learning this as a child with a sentence that is still striking in its precision. He said he felt abandoned and chosen simultaneously, as if both things were true at the same time and neither one canceled the other out, which is, when you think about it, a remarkably sophisticated thing to feel at age 7. Most adults spend entire decades in therapy trying to hold two contradictory truths at once and still emerge intact. Steve seems to have started there. Paul and Clara, to their enduring credit, never made the adoption a secret or a shadow. When Steve asked about it directly, and he did, with the directness that would become his signature, they told him flatly that they had chosen him. Specifically him. They had wanted him and gone and gotten him. The message was delivered with such conviction that Steve absorbed it, not as consolation but as fact. He was chosen, he was wanted, he was theirs. And yet, the question that lives inside every adopted child, the one that doesn't vanish just because the adoptive parents are loving and the house is warm, is the other question, the one that starts with why. Why was I the one left behind? What was wrong with me that someone looked at me and decided to walk the other direction? It is worth saying clearly, nothing was wrong with him. Joanne Schiebel's decision was made under pressures that had nothing to do with the specific weight of this specific baby in her arms. She was a young woman in 1955, in a country that offered her essentially no good options, trying to do the most loving thing she could imagine for a child she could not keep. By any honest accounting, she succeeded. She found him a family that adored him. But children don't do accounting. They do feeling. And the feeling Steve Jobs carried, quietly, underneath everything, was a restless, driving need to matter. To make something so undeniably significant that the question of his worth would become permanently, obviously, laughably moot. That hunger would later get dressed up in the language of perfection and vision and revolution, and it was all of those things too. But at its root, you can hear the echo of a baby in San Francisco and a young woman who couldn't stay. Mountain View in those years was starting to hum with a particular kind of energy, the low electrical frequency of engineers and inventors who had begun clustering in the neighborhoods around Stanford University. Paul Jobs, who spent his weekends restoring old cars in the garage, had a gift for mechanics and a genuine philosophy about craft, that the back of a cabinet matters as much as the front, that invisible work is still work, that things should be made right all the way through. He passed this to Steve less through lectures than through proximity, the boy watching his father's hands, absorbing without knowing he was absorbing. It would be years before any of this resolved into something recognizable as destiny. For now, Steve was simply a small boy in a small house in a valley that didn't have its famous name yet, carrying inside him the ordinary, extraordinary weight of a child who knows, in his bones, that he arrived here through a door most people don't use. That knowledge can break a person, or it can light a fire. In Steve Jobs, improbably, stubbornly, magnificently, it did the second thing. He would spend the rest of his life proving, to the woman in San Francisco, to the board members who would later doubt him, to everyone who ever looked at him and miscalculated, that leaving him behind was the most expensive mistake anyone ever made. Chapter 2. The Curious Boy in the Valley. Kakere Chapter 2. The Curious Boy in the Valley. The garage smelled like motor oil and possibility. Paul Jobs kept it meticulously organized. Tools hung in silhouette outlines he'd painted on the pegboard so he'd always know when something was missing. He wasn't a sentimental man in the usual ways, didn't recite poetry or narrate his feelings, but watch him with a piece of machinery and you understood immediately what he loved. He loved the hidden logic of things. He'd pull apart a carburetor the way another man might read a letter from an old friend, slowly and with complete attention, and then he'd explain each piece to his small, dark-eyed son standing beside him on a step stool. Steve wasn't always the most patient student, but he listened. Mountain View in the early 1960s was not yet famous. It was suburban and unhurried, full of ranch houses and apricot orchards that were still losing their slow argument against tract development. The families who lived there worked at Lockheed and Hewlett-Packard and Varian Associates, companies whose names meant nothing to the country at large, but whose engineers were quietly reshaping the physics of the modern world. It was, in other words, a strange and fortunate place to grow up if your brain happened to work the way Steve Jobs' brain worked. Sideways, restlessly, always looking for the thing beneath the thing. His neighbor Larry Lang was an engineer at Hewlett-Packard who saw the boy's hunger for circuitry and did something generous. He fed it. Lang showed Steve how to build Heathkit projects, those mail-order electronic kits that arrived in flat cardboard boxes with dense instruction manuals and emerged, if you were patient enough, as functional radios and oscilloscopes. The kits came with all the answers already printed, every connection explained, every component labeled, but they also came with something more valuable. They came with proof. Proof that a machine was not magic. Proof that a person, alone in a garage with enough curiosity and enough stubbornness, could build something that actually worked. Steve took that proof and filed it somewhere deep. School was a different matter entirely. Cupertino's Monte Loma Elementary received Steve Jobs the way a tidy house receives a golden retriever puppy, with good intentions that eroded quickly. He was bored before the teacher finished the first sentence. He was disruptive in the casual, inventive way that only genuinely intelligent children can be disruptive, not mean-spirited, just constitutionally incapable of pretending to care about things he didn't care about. He put a snake in a teacher's desk drawer. He convinced a classmate to put his framed class photo into a kid's bicycle. He treated the school day less like an education and more like a long obstacle course he was being forced to run in shoes that didn't fit. His third-grade teacher, a woman named Imogen Hill, whom everyone called Teddy, decided she'd had enough of this, but not in the way you'd expect. Instead of crushing the defiance out of him, she bribed it. She gave Steve a large lollipop and $5 and told him she'd give him more if he completed a thick math workbook she'd prepared. What happened next surprised even him. He finished it in a few days. Not because of the bribe exactly. He'd forgotten about the bribe. He'd just gotten interested. Teddy Hill looked at what Steve had done and understood something about him that he didn't yet fully understand about himself. That his problem was never ability, and it was never even motivation. His problem was that no one had yet handed him something worthy of his attention. By the end of third grade, she had him tested. The results suggested he was operating at a high school level. The school wanted to skip him ahead 2 grades. His parents, sensibly worried about their wiry, sometimes volatile son being hurled into a social situation 2 years above him, negotiated it down to 1. It was the right call. Steve was already an unusual kid in ways that had nothing to do with grade level, intense, sensitive beneath the bravado, prone to long private obsessions and then to wanting the whole world to share in them immediately. Homestead High School held him in the way a river holds a fast fish, technically, but not really. He dressed strangely, kept to the margins of social life, and spent hours in HP's open lecture series where engineers gave informal talks to anyone who showed up. He showed up, a skinny teenager in the audience full of adults with badges, asking questions that made the presenters pause and collect themselves before answering. He had a gift, already visible, for identifying the central nerve of any problem and pressing on it until something useful happened. He also had a gift for being insufferable, let's be honest about that. He was arrogant in the way that very young, very smart people sometimes are before the world has had adequate opportunity to humble them. Absolutely certain of his own perceptions, impatient with slower minds, unimpressed by credentials. Some of his teachers disliked him on principle. Others saw past the sandpaper surface to something that felt, if they were honest with themselves, a little like responsibility. Like they had stumbled across something rare and breakable and were now on the hook for it. Electronics class changed everything in the small, quiet way that the most important changes usually arrive. There, for the first time, Steve found himself in a room full of students who shared his frequency. The teacher treated the material seriously. The projects were real. The conversations after class, huddled around breadboards and oscilloscopes, had the low electric hum of people who believe they are working on something that actually matters. He was 15, 16, walking home through the valley's flat, dry evening air after those sessions, and the world must have felt enormous in the particular way it feels enormous when you are young and smart and haven't yet been told very clearly what you can and cannot do. The apricot orchards were mostly gone by then. In their place stood the low, careful buildings of companies that made things no one had made before. Steve walked past them and felt, apparently, not intimidation but recognition. This was his landscape. He just didn't have a name for it yet. Paul Jobs had given him something in that motor oil garage, something harder to measure than a specific skill. He'd given Steve the idea that the inside of a thing was worth understanding, that craftsmanship was not decoration, not excess, but the very heart of whether something was good or not. Years later, Steve would insist that the back panels of Apple computers be finished as beautifully as the fronts, even though no customer would ever see them. He'd been asked more than once why it mattered if no one was looking. He never seemed to find the question anything other than strange. Paul Jobs had answered it already, a long time ago, on a step stool in a Mountain View garage, with a carburetor in his hands and a son listening close. Chapter 3. The Odd Pair in the Garage. The kid at the other end of the phone was babbling about frequencies. Steve Jobs was 13 years old, trying to build something electronic, and he'd done what any resourceful teenager in the early 1970s would do, found a name in the neighborhood directory and called a stranger for parts. The stranger who picked up was 21 years old, soft-spoken, and almost pathologically happy to talk about circuits. His name was Steve Wozniak, and within the first 10 minutes of that phone call, something clicked between them that neither could quite articulate but both immediately recognized. Here was someone else who thought that way. Fast, sideways, hungry, They were, on paper, a ridiculous pairing. Wozniak, Woz, everyone called him, was a gentle giant of a man, the kind of person who laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them and genuinely could not understand why other people didn't find resistors as exciting as he did. He had no particular appetite for power or money. He wanted to build things, beautiful, elegant things, and then show them to his friends. Jobs, 5 years younger and still a teenager wearing the particular awkwardness of adolescence like an ill-fitting coat, was almost his mirror opposite. Restless, combustible, social in the way that a spark is social with dry wood. Where Woz saw the engineering problem, Jobs saw something further out. A horizon, an audience, a world that didn't know yet what it was missing. What bound them, immediately and stubbornly, was mischief. Their first great collaboration was not a computer, it was a prank. Actually, it was a series of pranks, conducted with the focused enthusiasm of two people who have found their tribe in each other. Jobs had a gift for finding the line between audacious and catastrophically stupid, and an even greater gift for convincing Woz that they were safely on the right side of it. Woz, for all his brilliance, was not a man who could resist an interesting technical challenge wrapped in a funny story, and Jobs kept supplying both. But the prank that mattered, the one that was less a prank and more a glimpse of something dangerous and wonderful, was the blue box. Woz had read an article in Esquire magazine about phone freaks, people who had discovered that the American telephone network could be hijacked using precise audio tones. He lit up the way he always lit up, which was to say completely and immediately, and called Jobs. Jobs drove over the same night. By morning, Woz had started designing a device that could generate those tones. A blue box, they called it, because the original crude versions used blue plastic housings, and Jobs had already started thinking about who would buy one. What they had built was, technically speaking, illegal. The blue box let its user place free long-distance calls by mimicking the signals the phone company used internally. They tested it by calling the Vatican and asking, in terrible accents, to speak to the Pope. They were told His Holiness was asleep. They sold blue boxes to college students for $150 apiece, which felt like a fortune, and which Jobs later described as the moment he understood that two guys in a room could build something that could control billions of dollars of infrastructure. He was not speaking hyperbolically. He genuinely meant it. The blue box was not the point. The point was what it proved, that the world's systems were not as locked as they appeared, that if you understood how something worked, really understood it, you could reach inside and rearrange it. Woz understood this as an engineering insight. Jobs understood it as a philosophy. By the mid-1970s, both Steves had orbited in and out of college. Jobs had spent one semester at Reed College in Oregon before dropping out and sleeping on dormitory floors, sitting in on classes that interested him and ignoring the ones that didn't, eating free meals at the local Hare Krishna temple, and slowly developing the peculiar combination of aesthetic sensibility and absolute conviction that would define him. Woz had gone to Berkeley. Both of them had wound up, by various routes, working at or around the nascent technology scene beginning to bubble up around the San Francisco Bay. And then Woz built the computer. He called it the Apple I, and he designed it largely for himself, for the joy of it, the same way he designed everything. He showed it to the Homebrew Computer Club, a gathering of enthusiasts and hobbyists who met in Menlo Park and shared technical ideas with the cheerful communalism of people who believed technology was a gift to be freely given. Woz wanted to distribute the schematics for free. Jobs looked at what his friend had made and saw something else entirely. He saw a product. He saw a company. They had an argument about this, not their last, and Jobs won, partly through sheer persistence and partly because he was right. There were people out there who wanted a computer but had no idea how to build one from a schematic. There was a market. They just had to reach it. In 1976, in the Jobs family garage in Los Altos, they incorporated Apple Computer with a third partner, a former Atari employee named Ronald Wayne, who drew the first Apple logo, a fussy Victorian illustration of Isaac Newton under a tree, and contributed some early legal work before promptly selling his 10% stake back to Jobs and Wozniak for $800, a decision that history has rendered the most expensive exit in the annals of cold feet. Wayne was older and more cautious, and he had seen too much to believe in this the way they did. Jobs and Wozniak believed with a kind of reckless totality that left no room for caution. The garage was not romantic. It was warm in the summer, and it smelled like motor oil, and Clara Jobs would bring them sandwiches they mostly forgot to eat. They worked on folding tables. Jobs badgered suppliers, negotiated prices, pushed Woz to finish, pushed everyone around him with the quiet violence of someone who does not understand that other people get tired. Woz, who did get tired, stayed anyway because he loved building the thing and because Jobs made him believe that the thing mattered. They were 21 and 26 years old, an engineer who wanted to make beautiful objects and a dreamer who wanted to change the world, and somehow those two incompatible ambitions had snapped together like magnets in a garage on the edge of nowhere, in a valley that was quietly becoming the center of everything. Neither of them could have done it alone. That was the part that never quite fit either of their mythologies, but it was true, and somewhere underneath the years of triumph and bitterness and legend that would follow, each of them knew it. Chapter 4. The Revolution in a Box. Picture a beige box sitting on a kitchen table in Fresno, or a den in Columbus, or a spare bedroom in Portland. Not in a laboratory, not in a corporate data center the size of a football field, just a kitchen table next to the salt shaker and somebody's half-finished cup of coffee. That image, mundane, domestic, almost laughably ordinary, was precisely the revolution Steve Jobs had in mind. The Apple II landed in stores in 1977, and it did something no computer had quite managed before. It looked like it belonged in your house. It came in a sleek, injection-molded plastic case that Jobs had obsessed over, insisting the color be just right, the seams clean, the whole thing as unthreatening as a toaster. There was no exposed circuit board, no blinking command prompt that made you feel like you needed an engineering degree just to say hello. There was a keyboard and a monitor and a promise. This thing is for you. You, specifically. The person who has absolutely no idea what a transistor is. The public, as it turned out, had been waiting for exactly that kind of promise. Sales climbed. Then they climbed faster. Schools bought them. Dentist offices bought them. A spreadsheet program called VisiCalc, which ran on the Apple II, became the machine's killer application. Suddenly, small business owners could do in minutes what had taken them hours of pencil and eraser accounting, and they went out and bought an Apple II just to run it. Within 2 years, Apple's revenue was in the tens of millions. By 1980, when the company went public in one of the most frenzied IPOs Wall Street had seen in years, Steve Jobs became worth something in the neighborhood of $200 million. He was 25 years old. Let that sit for a moment. He had not yet hit the age when most people are still figuring out how to do their own laundry, and he was worth more money than most human beings would see across a dozen lifetimes. The kid from Mountain View who had been restless and prickly and difficult to love was now, by any financial measure the world recognized, a success. He wore that success like a man who wasn't entirely sure it fit, lurching between genuine pride and a gnawing certainty that whatever he'd done, it wasn't yet the thing he actually meant to do. That thing, it turned out, was the Macintosh. The seeds of it were planted during a visit Jobs made to Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center in 1979. What the engineers there had built was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential sets of ideas in computing history, a graphical interface where images and icons stood in for lines of typed code, and a small handheld device called a mouse that let you point at things on a screen like a human being pointing at things in the real world. Xerox, bafflingly, was not in a hurry to bring any of this to market. Jobs watched the demonstration and essentially lost his mind, not in rage but in joy, in the unbearable clarity of someone who has just seen the future and cannot believe it is sitting in a room being ignored. He went back to Apple and told his teams, "This is what computers should be. This, the pointing, the pictures, the thing that feels like thought." The project was secretive, stormy, and completely consuming. Jobs drove the Macintosh team with a combination of inspiration and terror that became legendary even at a company that was already used to his extremes. He pushed engineers to hit deadlines that seemed physically impossible. He sent designs back because the circuit board inside the case wasn't beautiful enough, Not functional, beautiful, as though the parts no one would ever see still deserved to be made with care. His people burned out and came back and burned out again, and some of them would later describe those years as the worst and best of their professional lives simultaneously, which is either a ringing endorsement or a cry for help depending on how you look at it. Then, on January 22, 1984, 67 million people watching the Super Bowl saw something unprecedented during a commercial break. A woman in orange shorts sprinted down a gray corridor, pursued by helmeted riot police, while ranks of pale, shaved-head drones sat watching a giant telescreen on which a droning authoritarian voice spoke of purified information. She reached the screen, swung a sledgehammer, and in the explosion of white light the drones were freed. A title card announced that on January 24th, Apple Computer would introduce the Macintosh, and then, with a phrasing that carried both mischief and menace, "And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. The room went quiet in living rooms across America for about 3 seconds, and then everyone started talking at once. Ridley Scott directed it. It cost somewhere around $900,000 to produce. Apple's own board of directors had watched the finished cut and hated it, had instructed the company's ad agency to sell the Super Bowl airtime back and had failed. The ad ran once on national television and nothing was ever quite the same. 2 days later, Jobs walked out onto a stage in Cupertino, reached into a canvas bag, and pulled out a small computer. He let it speak for itself, literally, because the Macintosh had a speech synthesizer built in, and the crowd heard a computer introduce itself in a halting, almost endearingly robotic voice. The place went absolutely wild. Grown engineers and programmers who had spent years in the business were weeping, though most of them would have denied it strenuously. What the Macintosh gave the world was a new language between human beings and machines. Instead of memorizing strings of commands and typing them into an unforgiving black void, you moved a mouse, pointed at pictures, clicked. You didn't speak the computer's language anymore. It had learned yours. This seems obvious now, the way running water and electric light seem obvious, which is exactly the mark of an idea that has succeeded so completely it has erased the memory of the world before it. Jobs understood that technology only matters when it stops feeling like technology. The computer had to disappear into the experience of using it, the way a well-made tool disappears into the hand that holds it. He had been saying this in various ways for years, to anyone who would listen, in meetings and arguments and late-night sessions where whiteboards filled up and emptied and filled again. In 1984, in a beige box with a small square screen and a mouse on a plastic pad, he finally proved it. Chapter 5: The Exile. The meeting where they told Steve Jobs he was finished lasted less than an hour. He walked out of it into the California sun, 30 years old, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and utterly, catastrophically lost. The short version of what happened at Apple in 1985 is that Jobs had become impossible to work with, and everyone finally said so at the same time. The longer version involves a boardroom power struggle with CEO John Sculley, a man Jobs himself had recruited by famously asking him whether he wanted to sell sugar water for the rest of his life, and a product division called Macintosh that was hemorrhaging money and missing targets. The board sided with Sculley. Jobs was stripped of his operational duties and marooned in a ceremonial office, so empty of purpose that colleagues called it Siberia, though Siberia at least has a reason to exist. He resigned in September, taking 5 senior Apple employees with him, and issued a statement about new beginnings that fooled almost nobody, least of all himself. By his own later admission, he didn't know what to do with his hands. There is something almost comic about a man worth $250 million describing himself as lost, and Jobs was self-aware enough, at least in retrospect, to understand the absurdity. But money had never been the architecture he lived inside. Meaning was the architecture. Apple had been the vessel for everything he believed about what technology could be, not a tool, but a statement about human possibility. And without it, he wandered through his enormous mansion in Woodside, California, rattling around in rooms where he'd never quite gotten around to buying furniture. Visitors described a house that felt less like a home than a beautiful, echoing void. He ate simply, he walked a lot, he brooded extensively. Then, because he was Steve Jobs, he started a computer company. Next Computer was born in late 1985 from the same hunger that had always driven him, the conviction that he could make something that hadn't existed before, something so elegantly constructed that owning it would feel like an education. The target market was universities and scientific institutions, people who needed serious computational power, and Jobs was certain would appreciate a machine that looked like it belonged in a museum of modern art. He commissioned a logo from Paul Rand, one of the greatest graphic designers alive, who charged Jobs $100,000, delivered a single option, and told him he could take it or leave it. Jobs took it. It was a perfect black cube on a white background, which was fitting, because the Next Computer itself, when it finally arrived, was also a perfect black cube, so dense and precisely manufactured that the engineers privately called it the most expensive paperweight ever assembled. The company lost money at a spectacular rate. Jobs' perfectionism, always his greatest gift and most exhausting liability, metastasized in the absence of any adult guardrails. He insisted that the machine's interior be painted a particular shade of flat black because he wanted it to be beautiful even where no user would ever see. Suppliers were terrorized, deadlines evaporated. When Next finally shipped its first workstation in 1988, it was technically extraordinary and commercially negligible, priced so far beyond what most customers could justify that it became an admired object of desire rather than an actual product. Jobs had built a masterpiece that almost nobody bought, and yet something was happening to him in those years that he couldn't have orchestrated on purpose. Without the armor of Apple's success, without the stage and the crowd and the guaranteed standing ovation, he had to learn to work longer and quieter. He had to build culture from scratch. He had to be wrong, repeatedly, in front of people he'd hired with promises he couldn't always keep. Those who survived working with him during this period noticed that, while he remained demanding to the point of cruelty, that part of his personality showed no signs of reform. There was an emerging willingness to sit with complexity, to revise, to iterate without declaring every first draft a masterpiece. He was learning something that no amount of early success can teach: how to fail and still show up the next morning. The other thing he did during the wilderness years was almost accidental. In 1986, Jobs purchased a small graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas, who needed to liquidate assets during a divorce. He paid $10 million for it, which at the time seemed like an impulsive luxury. The division was staffed with eccentric, technically brilliant people who were obsessed with the idea of making movies entirely on computers. They called themselves Pixar. Jobs did not, initially, fully understand what he had. His plan was to sell Pixar's proprietary graphics hardware to hospitals and government agencies, which is a sentence that sounds less like a founding vision than a fever dream. The hardware business failed. Jobs poured in more money, then more still. By some estimates, he invested close to $50 million of his own fortune into Pixar over the years, often questioning whether he should cut his losses entirely. There were multiple serious conversations about selling the company. The decision not to became one of the defining non-decisions of his life. What saved it was animation. The small creative team, led by a soft-spoken director named John Lasseter, kept making short films, extraordinary ones, that won awards and turned heads. They were also quietly developing the software and storytelling philosophy that would eventually produce a deal with Disney and a movie called Toy Story. Jobs began to see it, slowly, and then all at once, the way you finally understand a piece of music after you've lived with it long enough. These people were doing something as radical as anything Apple had ever attempted. They were building an entirely new form of cinematic art. He stopped trying to steer them and started protecting them instead. It was, for him, a relatively new skill. There is a version of the Steve Jobs story that treats these years as mere intermission, a parenthesis between the founding myth and the triumphant second act. That version misses the point. The exile was not wasted time. It was the tuition for everything that came next, paid in public humiliation, private doubt, and the slow, unglamorous work of learning that vision without discipline is just dreaming, and dreaming without patience is just noise. The wilderness did not break him. It finished him, the way a blade gets finished on a whetstone, by repeated, uncomfortable friction until the edge is finally true. He emerged from it hungrier than before, and considerably sharper. Chapter 6: Love, Family, and the Inner Life. There is a photograph that never made the papers. Steve Jobs, sometime in the late 1980s, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a spare room, a record playing, probably Dylan, probably loud, with tears running freely down his face. Not grief, exactly. Just music doing what music does to people who let it all the way in. Most of the world knew Jobs as the man who never let anything in without first deciding it wasn't good enough. His inner life told a different story. He was not an easy man to love. That is perhaps the most honest way to begin. The same intensity that made him a revolutionary made him, in close quarters, exhausting and at times genuinely cruel. He could look at someone who had given months of their life to a project and tell them, without blinking, that their work was garbage. He had a way of rewriting his own history in real time, genuinely believing the revised version. These were not endearing qualities. They made his personal life, particularly in the 1980s, a kind of wreckage that ran alongside the professional one. The most painful chapter in that wreckage had a name: Lisa. Chrisanne Brennan, Jobs' on and off girlfriend from his teenage years, gave birth to a daughter in May 1978. Jobs, 23 years old and newly wealthy from Apple's early success, denied that the child was his. He did this with an almost spectacular commitment to the denial, going so far as to sign a legal document claiming he was sterile, a claim that must have required some creative relationship with the facts given what would come later. A paternity test eventually confirmed what was obvious. Jobs paid child support but kept his emotional distance. He named a computer after his daughter before he was willing to call himself her father out loud, which is either poignant or maddening depending on your mood, and possibly both at once. The reckoning came slowly, the way real reckonings tend to. By the time Lisa was in her early teens, Jobs had begun making genuine efforts to pull her into his life. It was imperfect, inconsistent, and sometimes hurtful. She would later write candidly about the complications of having him as a father, but there was real movement toward her, and real love behind the movement, however badly delivered. Lisa eventually came to live with him for a period of time. He was not the father she deserved in her earliest years, he knew it. Knowing it didn't fix the damage, but it mattered that he knew. Somewhere in the middle of all this, he met Laureen Powell. It was December 1989, and Jobs was scheduled to give a lecture at Stanford Business School. Laureen was a student. They ended up sitting next to each other. He thought she was stunning. She thought he was interesting. He had his car waiting to take him somewhere important, and he sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes deciding whether to go back inside to talk to her, and then he went back inside to talk to her. Some decisions, even for a man who agonized over the radius of a screen corner, are worth making impulsively. They were married in March 1991 at the Awani Hotel in Yosemite in a Buddhist ceremony led by Jobs' Zen teacher Kobun Chino Otogawa. By all accounts, it was simple and quiet and nothing like what you'd expect from a man who was then orchestrating some of the most theatrical product launches in corporate history. They would go on to have 3 children together, Reed, Aaron, and Eve, and build a family life in Palo Alto that was, by the standards of Silicon Valley royalty, remarkably unguarded. Laureen was not a supporting character. She was sharp, principled, and entirely unbothered by the reality distortion field that bent most people in her husband's orbit. She built her own career and her own philanthropic work. She pushed back on him when he needed pushing back on, which was frequently. Friends observed that she was one of the very few people who could reach him when he had gone somewhere unreachable. Their marriage was not without its difficulties. Living with Steve Jobs was by any reasonable measure not a restful experience, but it was a real partnership, and it grounded him in ways that nothing professional ever quite could. The home they shared was notably understated for a billionaire's house. Jobs had strong opinions about furniture that he could never quite commit to purchasing, which meant rooms sometimes sat empty for months while he decided what belonged in them. He cared intensely about how objects occupied space. He cared intensely about dinner table conversation. He wanted his kids to read widely and think for themselves and argue with him, which they did. And beneath all of it ran the current of Zen Buddhism, which Jobs had not picked up casually. He had traveled to India at 19 searching for something he couldn't name, and though he came home without finding it in any obvious form, he came home changed. He began practicing Zen seriously in the early 1980s and stayed with it for the rest of his life. It shaped the way he thought about simplicity, the idea that what you remove matters as much as what you keep. It shaped the way he thought about death, which he returned to with a consistency that might seem morbid if it hadn't made him so relentlessly alive. He read deeply and widely. Shakespeare, William Blake, Herman Melville, the poetry that crackles with someone trying to say what can't quite be said. He could quote Blake in a product meeting and mean it. He wept at music in a way that embarrassed some people and moved others. Dylan, the Beatles, Yo-Yo Ma, these weren't background noise to him. They were, he believed, evidence of what human beings were actually capable of when they worked at the edge of their ability and their feelings simultaneously. That was the standard he held himself to. It was also the standard he inflicted on everyone around him, which explains both the great products and the considerable body count of bruised colleagues. The tension at the center of Steve Jobs, the private man, was this. He believed, genuinely and without irony, in beauty and meaning and love. He also behaved with some regularity in ways that undermined all three. He was not a hypocrite about it so much as someone at perpetual war with the gap between what he valued and what he was capable of in a given moment. He loved his children and sometimes made them feel invisible. He loved music that broke open the human heart and sometimes spoke to his colleagues as if they had no hearts to break. What Lorene gave him, and what his children gave him, and what the long, quiet practice of Zen gave him, was something the boardrooms and the keynotes never could, a reminder that he was not only what he built, he was also, improbably and often awkwardly, a husband and a father and a man sitting on a floor somewhere, letting a song take him completely apart, with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Chapter 7. The Return of the King. Apple Computer in early 1997 was a company that smelled like fear, not metaphorically. Walk the halls of one infinite loop in Cupertino and you could sense it in the two long silences, the canceled projects, the engineers updating their resumes on company time. Market share had collapsed from a peak near 20% to something south of 4%. The product line had metastasized into a bewildering maze of models with nearly identical names: the Performa 5400, the Performa 6400, the Power Mac 7600, that no sane customer could tell apart and no confident salesperson could explain. Michael Dell, asked publicly what he would do if he ran Apple, smiled and said he'd shut it down and return the money to shareholders. He was not entirely wrong. And then, in December 1996, Apple announced it would acquire Next Computer for $427 million. The press noted the dollar figure. What really mattered was the man who came with it. Steve Jobs returned to Apple the way a deposed king returns to a kingdom that burned down while he was away, with complicated feelings about whether he was rescuing it or it was rescuing him. He floated back first as an informal advisor, then as a consultant, watching Gil Amelio, the existing CEO, founder, and flail. It took only a handful of board meetings for Jobs to see what needed to happen, and only a handful more for the board to see it too. In July 1997, Amelio was gone. Jobs stepped in as interim CEO, a title he accepted with a shrug and held for 4 years. He insisted on the word interim the way a man who has been burned insists on testing the stove before he touches it. The first task was triage. Jobs gathered the product list and did something that felt almost violent to the people who'd spent years building those products. He drew a simple 2x2 grid. Consumer, professional, desktop, portable, 4 boxes. He told the room Apple would make 4 great computers and kill everything else. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone has just said something that is either visionary or catastrophic, and nobody is sure which yet. Dozens of products were canceled. Thousands of jobs were cut. Engineers who had given years to a machine watched it disappear from the roadmap in an afternoon. It was brutal, and it was correct. Jobs understood, with a clarity that bordered on the physical, that a company trying to be everything to everyone becomes nothing to no one. Focus wasn't a strategy to him, it was a moral position. Then came the moment that required a different kind of courage entirely. In August 1997, Jobs walked out onto the Macworld stage in Boston and announced that Apple had struck an investment deal with Microsoft. Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen overhead, beamed in by satellite. a face so enormous and so unexpected that a portion of the audience actually booed. Jobs stood there and let them. He had just made peace with the enemy, taken $150 million from the man the Mac faithful considered the embodiment of everything soulless in the industry, and he did it because Apple needed the money and needed the signal. We are still here, we are solvent, and we are not too proud to survive. The booing was understandable. Apple's core customers felt like they'd watched their church accept a donation from the casino next door. But Jobs had done the math, and the math was merciless. Pride does not pay servers. Conviction does not make payroll. What he gave them instead, a few weeks later, was something that fed a different kind of hunger. The Think Different campaign launched in September 1997, and it arrived less like an advertisement than like a statement of identity. The television spot featured black and white footage of Einstein, Gandhi, Picasso, Amelia Earhart, Muhammad Ali, Jim Henson, the restless, the difficult, the people who had refused the world as they found it. A quiet voiceover declared that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. No product was shown, no price was listed. Apple was not selling a computer. Apple was selling the idea that buying a computer could mean something about who you were. Jobs had reviewed the ad with Lee Clow and his team at TBWA Shia Day, and according to those in the room, he wept. Not the polished emotional display of a man who had learned that vulnerability plays well in meetings. Genuinely wept because the campaign described him too, the kid who had been pushed out, the exile, the one who had been told he was wrong about everything. He had returned to Apple carrying 12 years of being underestimated, and here was a 30-second film that insisted being difficult and visionary was the same thing. It is hard to sell a product with a philosophy. It turned out it was the only way to sell Apple. The turnaround that followed was not instantaneous. Real recoveries never are, despite what retrospective accounts suggest. There were months of grinding uncertainty, suppliers who needed convincing, retailers who needed reassuring, employees who needed to believe that this time it was going to be different. Jobs moved through all of it with a relentlessness that people around him found both inspiring and exhausting, often in the same afternoon. He was not easy. He was never easy, but he was, for the first time in a long time, pointed in a single direction. What the outside world saw was a company finding its footing. What was actually happening was something stranger and more human. A man discovering that his years of failure had not wasted him, that the things he'd learned in exile about patience and product and the real cost of complexity had been preparation in disguise. The wilderness had looked like punishment. It turned out to be tuition. By the spring of 1998, Apple was profitable again. Not dramatically, not yet, but the bleeding had stopped. The product line was clean. The brand meant something. And somewhere in the labs, a small team was working on a computer that would be translucent and colorful, and unlike anything anyone had ever put on a desk. Steve Jobs stood at the edge of what would become the most creative decade of his career, and for once he didn't seem to be sprinting toward it out of anger. He seemed, in his own thorny and complicated way, to be ready. Chapter 8. One More Thing. Here is a thing worth understanding about Steve Jobs in the years between 1998 and 2011. He did not think he was making products. He thought he was making arguments. Arguments that the world had been settling for too little, accepting too much clutter and ugliness and confusion, and that someone needed to stand up in front of a crowd and demonstrate with a straight face that it did not have to be this way. He was very good at standing up in front of crowds. The iMac arrived in 1998 wearing a color called Bondi Blue, which is a shade borrowed from an Australian beach and has no business appearing on a computer. It was translucent. You could see the guts of it through the shell. Every other computer on the market looked like something a dentist's office had ordered in bulk and forgotten to personalize. The iMac looked like it had been designed by someone who had actually considered the possibility that human beings would have to look at it. It sold 2 million units in its first year, and overnight the word design became something technology companies were embarrassed not to mention. Jobs was 43 when the iMac launched. He had been back at Apple for less than a year. The speed at which he moved suggested a man who felt time differently than other people did, not as an abstraction but as a creditor, one he owed a significant debt and intended to repay. The iPod followed in 2001, and this is where the mythology starts to compound on itself, because by all reasonable accounts it should not have worked as well as it did. There were already MP3 players on the market. They were largely terrible, clunky interfaces, baffling software, the aesthetic appeal of a scientific calculator. Jobs walked on stage in October of that year and held up a small white device that fit in the pocket of his jeans. 1,000 songs in your pocket, he said, as if this were the most natural sentence in the world. Then iTunes arrived to organize the chaos of digital music into something coherent and legal, and the record industry, which had spent 3 years treating its own customers like criminals for downloading music, suddenly found itself in an unlikely partnership with a computer company. The whole arrangement was remarkable. It was also completely Jobs. Identify the actual problem underneath the obvious problem, solve the real one, and make it look like the obvious move in hindsight. What the public did not always see was the interior cost of these years. The perfectionism that produced icons also produced legendary explosions in conference rooms, designers reduced to silence by a single withering word, engineers who described working for Jobs as simultaneously the best and most destabilizing experience of their careers. He could look at something months in the making and say it was not good enough with a certainty so absolute it left no room for appeal. Then, occasionally, he would see someone execute something genuinely extraordinary and his face would change, open up, almost childlike, and he would say it was the best thing he had ever seen, and the person he said it to would go home and not sleep because they were still running on the voltage of it. Both things were true. He contained them both without apparent contradiction. The iPhone, however, was the one. If Jobs had stopped there and handed back his turtleneck and gone to live quietly somewhere without Wi-Fi, the iPhone alone would have secured his place in whatever hall we reserve for people who genuinely moved the furniture of civilization around. He announced it on January 9, 2007, at the Macworld Conference in San Francisco, and the presentation he gave that morning is worth watching now, not for nostalgia, but for the architecture of it, the way he built toward the reveal like a composer working through a first movement. He told the audience he was going to introduce 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, a breakthrough internet communications device. He said it twice, let the crowd applaud 3 separate times, and then said, "These are not 3 separate devices, this is one device." The room came apart. What he was holding was a phone that had no physical keyboard, whose entire face was a single touchscreen of glass, and which contained the internet in a form that actually worked on a device you could carry in your shirt pocket. He spent 2 hours on stage that morning demonstrating it with the relaxed precision of a magician who has practiced so long that the trick looks like gravity. At one point, he called a Starbucks using the phone and ordered 4,000 lattes. He was kidding. The audience was not entirely sure he was kidding, which is its own kind of power. Everything about the modern smartphone, the gestures, the apps, the assumption that the internet lives in your hand, traces its lineage to that morning in January 2007 in a way that is not metaphorical but literal and direct. The world divided cleanly into before and after. The iPad arrived in 2010 and was greeted, for about 48 hours, with widespread public skepticism and a great deal of jokes about the name. Within a year, it had sold 15 million units and created an entirely new product category that analysts had confidently declared nobody needed. Jobs had a gift for this particular maneuver, manufacturing desire for things people had not known they were missing, then watching the market catch up to what he had already decided was inevitable. At each of these announcements, he stood in the same uniform, black mock turtleneck, Levi's 501s, New Balance sneakers, a costume so consistent it became a kind of armor, or maybe a statement, the visual equivalent of saying that the work was the only variable worth changing. Audiences at those keynotes described them later with words usually reserved for concerts or tent revivals. People laughed, they leaned forward, they startled. He made them feel, inexplicably, that they were present for something that mattered, that the stakes of a product announcement extended beyond the product itself and into some larger argument about what human beings deserved from the tools they used every day. He was, in the fullest sense of the phrase, a performer. But the performance was in service of a conviction so total and so stubbornly maintained across decades that it ceased to function as showmanship and became something closer to faith. And like all genuine faith, it had the peculiar ability to make other people believe too, not because they were fooled, but because the belief itself, burning that brightly, was simply hard to look away from. Chapter 9: The Last Battle. The scan results came back in October 2003, and they were not good. A routine kidney scan, ordered for something else entirely, had caught a shadow on his pancreas that had no business being there. The doctors who reviewed the images grew quiet in the way doctors grow quiet when they are choosing their words carefully. Steve Jobs, 58 years old at the time, founder of one of the most valuable companies on the planet, possessor of a reality distortion field that had bent engineers and executives and entire industries to his will, sat with the news and then did what he always did when confronted with a reality he refused to accept. He tried to negotiate his way out of it. The diagnosis was a neuroendocrine tumor, a rare and slow-growing form of pancreatic cancer, not the swift and savage kind that kills most people within months, but a variety that, caught early enough and treated surgically, carries a meaningful chance of cure. His doctors were, by most accounts, cautiously optimistic. They pushed for an operation. Jobs said no. For 9 months he pursued a different path: special diets, acupuncture, herbal remedies, spiritual consultations. He had always believed that the body, like a machine, could be coaxed and reasoned with rather than simply cut open. He had always trusted his own instincts over the consensus of the room. Those instincts had made him a billionaire and a legend. Now they were quietly costing him something he could not replace. When he finally agreed to surgery in July 2004, the tumor had grown. The operation was successful, in the narrow sense that the surgeons removed what they found, but the window that had once stood open had narrowed considerably. Jobs would spend the rest of his life understanding at some subterranean level that his defiance, the same quality that made him extraordinary, had also made him complicit in his own decline. He admitted as much years later, quietly, to his biographer. It was one of the few times he called a decision of his own a mistake. For a while the world didn't know any of this. He stood on stage at Macworld in January 2005 looking thin but animated, and the audience cheered, and the products gleamed under the lights, and nobody said anything about cancer. Apple disclosed the surgery in a single spare press release. Jobs preferred it that way. He had always controlled the story. This one he was less certain he could control, and so he gripped it tighter. But bodies have their own timelines, and his was advancing. By 2008, the photographs told a story the press releases couldn't manage. The man who had always been slender now looked fragile, his turtleneck hanging differently, his face narrowed to something drawn and sharp. Apple attributed it to a hormone imbalance. Investors grew nervous, and their nervousness was not simply about stock price. It was the recognition, uncomfortable in its honesty, that one man's health had become indistinguishable from the fate of a $100 billion company. There is something almost absurd about that, and also something that speaks to just how thoroughly he had made himself the institution. In January 2009, he took a medical leave of absence. In April of that year, at a Tennessee medical center, he received a liver transplant, an organ replacement made possible partly because he had registered an estate with a shorter waiting list, a fact that struck some observers as characteristically resourceful and others as characteristically unfair. He returned to Apple that June, walking slowly and looking like a man who had bargained hard with something enormous and come back with the narrow end of the deal. What is striking about the years that followed is not the diminishment but the refusal to accept it. He climbed back onto stages. He unveiled the iPad in January 2010, holding the device in his lap the way you hold something you are genuinely proud of, like a person showing you a photo of someone they love. He introduced the iPhone 4 that June, brimming with an almost indignant enthusiasm about the antenna, even in the midst of a public relations headache over its reception problems. He was sick and he was fighting and he was, still, unmistakably himself. There is a photograph from a product event during that period. He is backlit by the usual enormous screen, dressed in the usual black turtleneck, and he looks impossibly thin, almost translucent, a man constructed entirely of will. And yet he is leaning slightly forward. the way someone leans forward when they have something important to say and cannot wait for the right moment because every moment feels like it is running short. He took a second medical leave in January 2011. He appeared at the iPad 2 launch in March, gaunt and unhurried, and the crowd gave him a standing ovation before he had said a single word. He announced iCloud in June at the Worldwide Developers Conference, wearing the same clothes, telling the same kind of story about how technology should feel, inevitable, invisible, human. That was his last keynote appearance. Through the summer and into the early fall of 2011, Jobs remained at home in Palo Alto, in the house he had lived in with Lorene and their children for 2 decades, a house famous for being less ostentatious than his fortune would have allowed, a house with a garden and a kitchen where he could argue about food and listen to Dylan and simply exist at a scale that had nothing to do with market capitalization. The family gathered, the circle drew close. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died. He was 56 years old, which is not old enough, not remotely, not for anyone. His sister, the novelist Mona Simpson, later described his final hours and his last words in a eulogy that circulated everywhere and made people who had never thought of themselves as Apple fans cry quietly at their desks. She wrote that he had looked at his children, looked at his wife, and then looked past them at something she could not see, and said, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Nobody knows what he saw. You could spend a long time thinking about that and not arrive anywhere definitive, which might have irritated him given how much he hated ambiguity in a finished product. But there is something fitting about the man who always insisted on one more detail, one more refinement, one more thing, meeting the end not with resignation but with what sounds improbably like astonishment. That evening, Apple's homepage went dark except for a single photograph, his face in black and white, looking directly at the camera the way he always had, like he still had something left to tell you. Chapter 10. The Infinite Loop. There is a street in Cupertino, California that loops back on itself. It has no beginning that isn't also an end. Apple's engineers named it Infinite Loop when they built the campus there in 1993, and they thought they were making a programmer's joke about code that runs forever. They had no idea they were writing a prophecy. Steve Jobs died on a Wednesday evening in October in his own home with his family around him. He was 56 years old. Within hours, people who had never met him stood outside Apple stores in cities across the world, leaving flowers, handwritten notes, half-eaten apples placed with a kind of wordless reverence on the sidewalk. It was, by any rational measure, a strange thing to do for a man who made consumer electronics. But grief rarely consults rationality, and what people were mourning was not a product manager. They were mourning the feeling that someone, somewhere, had been paying attention, had cared ferociously whether the corner of a laptop was rounded at precisely the right radius, had believed with an almost embarrassing sincerity that a device you held in your hand could be a civilizing instrument. When that kind of person disappears, the silence they leave behind has a specific shape. The tributes poured in from presidents and engineers, from designers who had once been humiliated by him in a conference room and had spent the intervening years being grateful for it. Bill Gates, his great rival, said that the personal computer industry would not have been what it was without Steve. That was generous, and probably true, and probably delivered through slightly gritted teeth, which is exactly how all the best eulogies work. The more interesting thing that happened after Jobs died is that the world kept doing what he had trained it to do, which was want more. The iPhone he had unveiled in January 2007, that glass and aluminum object he had called a revolutionary product, went on to become the best-selling consumer product in the history of the world. By the mid-2020s, there were more iPhones active on Earth than there were automobiles. People sleep with them. People name the Notes app as the place they keep their most private thoughts. Somewhere, right now, a person is using one to check their blood pressure, another is using one to record their child's first steps, another is using one to read a poem, and none of them are thinking about Steve Jobs, which is exactly what he would have wanted because what he always hated was being noticed for the technology itself. The technology was supposed to be invisible. It was supposed to feel like a natural extension of what a human hand and mind already wanted to do. That philosophy migrated. Car interiors simplified and went touchscreen. Hospital monitoring equipment started to look less like something built in 1987 and more like something you might actually want to have near you when you are frightened. Airport wayfinding, kitchen appliances, the shape of a hearing aid, the dashboard of a subway train. The Apple design language spread the way the best ideas always spread, not through imitation exactly, but through a kind of cultural permission. Once Jobs had demonstrated that a mass-market product could be beautiful and that people would pay for beauty, it became harder for any designer in any industry to argue that good enough was good enough. There is a paradox inside all of this, and it would be dishonest to paper over it. Steve Jobs was not, by any fair accounting, a gentleman. He told people their work was garbage. He cried on command and weaponized the tears. He denied paternity of his first child and then spent years making it right, which meant there was both the betrayal and the repair living inside the same biography. And you have to hold both, because dropping either one flattens him into something he was not. He was not a villain. He was not a saint. He was a person who contained extremes in proportions most of us are lucky enough never to encounter, in ourselves or in anyone we have to work for. What the world has kept returning to, in the years since his death, is not the cruelty and not the sainthood, but the question underneath both. What does it actually cost, and what does it actually produce when someone refuses, absolutely and without apology, to accept the world as it is? Jobs had been handed a complicated story from the very beginning. A mother who loved him enough to give him away, parents who loved him enough to choose him, a valley that was building the future in its backyards, a mind that could not stop seeing what was wrong with everything it touched. He ran that energy at full voltage for 56 years and left behind a body of work that is, whatever else you want to say about it, undeniable. The biography gets read, the film gets watched. The keynote clips get viewed by people who were not yet born when they were recorded, who watch a man in a black turtleneck stand on a stage and say, "One more thing," and feel something they cannot quite name. Partly it is the showmanship, partly it is the products, but mostly, probably, it is the feeling that he actually believed it, that when he said something was insanely great, he was not performing enthusiasm for shareholders, but was genuinely, almost embarrassingly moved by the fact that a button could feel right under a thumb, that an icon could have a shadow that made it look slightly more alive. The loop is the thing. Code that runs forever is a bug, a trap, a program that eats itself from the inside and never gets to the answer. But there is another way to read it, which is that some questions do not resolve. They just generate more questions, better ones, and those questions generate the next iteration, and on it goes. Steve Jobs did not answer the question of how one person can change the world. He just ran the loop long enough and hot enough that the question itself became impossible to dismiss. The flowers outside the Apple stores were a little embarrassing and also completely correct. People put them there because they understood, even if they could not say it in those words, that someone had burned through the available light faster than anyone thought possible and had somehow, in burning, made more light rather than less. The loop continues. The screen you might be reading this on is a distant grandchild of something he touched. That is not nothing. That is, by almost any reasonable measure, everything. You just watched what one life can become under pressure. Now ask yourself what you'll do with yours. Subscribe, and let's keep building this journey together.